Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. Well, you've probably heard the famous Star Trek phrase, space, the final frontier. And if you think about it, there's still a final frontier to be explored, and it is right here in our own bodies, our brain. Our brain is still a mystery in so many ways. There's still a lot to discover about how it works. Not to mention, we need to dispel some old beliefs that are no longer true according to the latest evidence. Lorraine Kalia is a neurologist and senior scientist with the Krembil Brain Institute at the University Health Network in Toronto. She says the brain is the most complex, interesting, and important organ in our bodies. And I bet a lot of people would agree with that. So I asked Lorraine to join us today to talk about what we know about the brain so far and where research is taking us. Hi, Lorraine. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
I want to ask you first, what fascinates you the most about the brain?
That's a great question, and so many different answers. I think probably what fascinates me most is really the unknowns and how much there is still to learn about it. It's such a fascinating organ that really impacts every other organ in the body and ultimately makes us the people that we are. It's the experiences that we have in our world and the way we react with them. That's all mediated by the brain. So really, ultimately, our brains are us. And we still don't quite understand all of the ways that it functions that way. And then as a neurologist, of course, I'm fascinated and really dedicated to trying to understand when things go wrong and, how can we fix that?
I wanted to ask you too, though, because for me, one of the biggest things I noticed was there was a time when we talked about this separation between the body and the brain. And people would say, oh, no, that is all in your head. As if that was like dismissive, as if it didn't really exist. And then, I don't know what discovery or what happened, but then, we realized that, no, wait a minute, the brain is part of our body. And as you point to the chemicals, there is something actually physical going on. You can't separate the physical from the brain. It's all the same thing.
Absolutely. And I think that there wasn't a kind of aha moment that allowed us to understand that. I think it's just over time, the appreciation of, this notion of everything's all in your brain, I think is such a funny notion because everything is all interconnected. I often give examples of how our body can manifest a whole bunch of different symptoms or effects because of what's happening in the brain. That's just because they're so interconnected. So, if I give the example of like when we're nervous, right? I mean, when we're feeling nervous, we're about to do something and that's kind of manifested in our brain. We're about to, meet somebody new or be on a podcast, and you're feeling nervous. And that actually, signals to other parts of your body. You can get a little sweaty. You can have an increased heart rate. That is actually your brain having an effect on your body. And at its very extreme, sometimes people can actually have neurological symptoms as a manifestation of aspects that are going on in their brain that aren't because of the kind of typical diseases we think of, but actually a manifestation of abnormal signaling in the brain that then cause abnormal signals to the other parts of our body and cause symptoms that are not symptoms that we want to have, obviously.
Yeah. Oh, it's also fascinating. I wanted to spend a little bit of time too talking about some of these beliefs that I think are pretty common that we have, but perhaps they're not true. Based on, just the evidence that has come out over the years. One of them is, and I still hear some people mention this, it's the whole idea of left brain versus right brain. We even used to kind of typecast people and that person is a right brain thinking person. They're very creative. They're very intuitive. And then the left brain people would be thought of as being, these rational, analytical thinkers. So talk about that. And is there any truth to that?
So it's such a romantic notion, isn't it? Just such, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could kind of bucket people in these two different ways and then just say, yep, that's because you're using this side of your brain more and I'm using this side of my brain more.
Yeah.
This kind of idea of a dichotomy and a kind of yin yang in our personalities. But no. So we definitely have, the brain has two sides. There's definitely a right side and a left side. If you ever look at, pictures of it, there's clearly two different areas. There is some truth to laterality of the brain, meaning that some things happen on one side of the brain versus the other. In very kind of textbook kind of ways. Language, our ability to understand language and to actually communicate with speech. In most people, that's dominated on the left side of their brain. Whereas interestingly, the ability to understand emotion when you hear somebody speak or actually put emotion into your voice, that actually comes from the other side of the brain. And then, of course, I'm sure many of the listeners know that, the right side of my brain is involved in me being able to move the left side of my body and also to feel on the left side of my body and vice versa. So there is a laterality to the brain, but this idea of us having these personality characteristic traits that are dominated by one side of the brain versus the other is unfortunately a myth.
Okay. And when it comes to like sort of most of how we use our brain, are we using like both sides? Is it not common that we would only use one side for whatever it is we're doing?
No, we are using lots of our brain. We are using both sides of our brain. We are using all through the brain. And the advent of like being able to image our brain and see the activity of it. So functional, imaging, PET scans, these kinds of technologies, functional MRIs that have actually allowed us to put people in a scanner, see how the brain is active, actually even put people through tasks sometime and see which parts of the brain light up. We know that we're using our whole brains.
So, okay, that's interesting because that leads me into the second so-called belief about only using 10% of our brain. I don't even know where that came from, but is that true?
I don't know where it came from either. I sometimes I wonder, is that because people thought that these neurons or nerve cells were really the important part? But they constitute more than 10% of our brain. But anyways, that is also not true. We use all our brain. And again, I think the functional imaging and these kinds of technologies that allow to see the activity of the brain has really demonstrated that. So if people go in these kind of scanners, you don't see just like 10% of the brain being active. It's a huge network and a variety of different areas of the brain. There are certain areas of the brain that, of course, will be more active for certain tasks versus others. But the idea that there's an area of the brain that is not doing anything or is like silent or quiet is not at all true. And I think part of that probably also comes from or came from the early days when people were trying to understand what parts of the brain were important. And so one way that they understood this was by studying people who had strokes, for example, or who had brain injuries, and then looking at what parts of the brain were affected. And we know that there are certain parts of the brain that if you injure it, you can do most basic functions okay. And even these days when we do scans for lots and lots of people, there are many times that you can find areas where people have had what we call silent strokes. So they've actually had a stroke in their brain. There's evidence of it, but they would have never known when it happened. There's no consequence from it. And so I think that might also feed into this idea that there's areas of the brain that we don't use, but actually every area of the brain is used, and every area of the brain is important in some way. Some obviously more fundamental. So if we, injure the area of the brain responsible for speech, then clearly that's going to be very detrimental. But if you injure a small area of the brain, maybe there's going to be some mild aspects that are going to be affected, but nothing that you're going to notice on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so that makes me wonder then, if we use pretty much all of our brain, right? If I think of somebody like Einstein and his brain, what's different from his brain and my brain if I use all of my brain too?
That's probably the $1 million question, right?
Like what, you know what I
No,
mean? They've
no.
studied his brain. I don't know if you know anything, but I think, okay, did he use more of his brain? Was his brain bigger than my brain? Like, what's the
Yeah.
difference?
I don't know. If I were to guess, it's going to be wiring. I think it's going to be the way it's wired. And how does that, what are the aspects that contribute to that? Partly genetics, partly,
Yeah.
environmental factors is the way that kind of everything is. But I'm going to guess it's more wiring, and not that he was able
Okay.
to reach into parts of his brain that you're not able to. But it might be connected a little bit differently.
Rats. Well, okay. So then it's so interesting. That now leads into this other belief about wiring. And can we actually improve that? Because, I mean, it must be like a multi-million-dollar business. All these brain games, brain exercises. It's supposed to keep us sharp and maybe even increase our brain effectiveness. And I hear things also like, oh, you should learn a new dance step because now you're creating new pathways in your brain and that's going to keep you sharp. Is there any truth to any of that?
So truth is a good question. I'm going to maybe step back and say, is there any solid scientific evidence for it?
Okay.
And, in the clinical realm, we think about evidence as, have there been any very good clinical trials where you take a group of people, they don't do anything, they watch TV or, just don't activate their brain at all. And if you take a group of people and make them do Sudoku and Wordle and crossword puzzles, will there be a difference? Not that I'm aware of, there are not any really solid, excellent studies that allow us to definitively say, yes, if you do these things, it's going to be better. That being said, when you kind of balance out things and think about risk and benefit, there's probably little to be lost to keep your brain active with learning a new dance step and kind of doing puzzles. I mean, I think the only loss is in your wallet if you're spending tons and tons of money on programs and different kind of fads to be able to do these tasks. But I think there's probably little to lose for a variety of reasons. But ultimately, I think probably spending time with exercise and social interaction and getting good sleep. We know that those things are definitely good for the brain.
Yeah, those for sure, right? Exercise, getting a good sleep. Yeah, that definitely affects how we perform cognitively, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's another one as well. And this is the belief that we are born with a finite number of brain cells, and that's it. That is it.
Yeah.
Is that true?
So that one is true. We are born with a finite number of brain cells. And probably by the time we hit our, adulthood 30s, we start actually losing brain cells. And
why? Why do we lose those brain cells in our 30s?
So in part because we don't have the capability of regenerating brain cells, except for in a very localized areas of the brain. There are certain areas of the brain where there are what we call stem cells, and there can be regeneration of cells, but we don't have the capacity to replace all of our brain cells. And so cells in general, I mean, they only have a finite amount of, they have a finite life. They require machinery to keep them alive. There's stressors and things, environmental kind of agents and just time that, they peter out just like kind of everything else, just like our joints peter out and these kinds of things. Brain cells do that too. And because they don't regenerate or they don't divide, the vast majority of them, then they die. And the kind of lifespan on them is different for different cells and different kinds of exposures. But that's the kind of natural history of brain cells. So,
and now we have different brain cells, right? They're not all equal. They're different. Yes. Do we know when they start to die? Which ones are the ones that die?
Yeah. So sorry, I should probably quantify that. So the nerve cells are the cells that can regenerate. The other types of cells, so what we call glial cells, they have the capability of regenerating. So there are new ones of those that can be made. But the nerve cells are ones that basically make up the electrical components of our brain. There's very few areas in the brain where there is a regeneration of those cells, and they do not have the capacity to replace every brain cell in our brain. And there's also a logistics aspect to our brain, because brain cells have to connect in particular ways to allow them to do what they need to do. And so even if one part of my brain, a very small part of my brain, is able to make new brain cells, the ability for that brain cell to get to the right place and then make the connection with the right other brain cell that it had been connected with, that's very, very difficult for brain cells to do.
Oh, okay. So just to clarify, you said nerve cells are the ones that don't regenerate. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'll maybe add one layer of complexity to it. So interestingly, nerve cells in the brain can't regenerate, whereas nerve cells that live outside of the brain, because we obviously have nerves that go to other parts of the body, they have some capacity to repair.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. So regarding the nerve cells in the brain that don't regenerate and they die, do we know how those nerve cells are connected to a certain function? And so now you see they die, and now you're going to lose something in some area, an ability to do something.
Fair. And so there are going to be some brain cells that you will notice, right? And like I should probably quantify. I mean, we do lose brain cells, but we have a lot. Like we're born probably with like 100 billion. But there are going to be certain brain cells that when they die, we will notice some changes. So probably age-related memory changes, not dementia, but normal changes that happen with our cognitive function as for many of us as we age. Those are related to brain cells that are being lost or becoming dysfunctional, that are involved in that task.
Okay, and so you said that the death of those nerve cells could be related to memory, right? So then am I going to assume from that, because this is another belief that people have, it's that it's normal to lose memory as we age. You just got to accept it. We're going to lose some memory. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. So maybe not for everybody. And I think there's variability, right? There's a bit of a spectrum. And you could even think about disease like Alzheimer's disease kind of being within that spectrum. Like that's kind of the extreme, where there's a process in place that's a disease process that's actually causing Alzheimer's disease. But there is still some cell loss that's happening as we age. And with that, there will be some mild cognitive effects. Yes. And so it's always interesting, I guess, how we define a disease. And what we call normal, right? Or healthy.
Right.
But I mean, often it's related to what the general population or the population what's their trajectory in terms of changes with their cognition. And I'd say, yes, if you look at a population of people as they age, there's going to be some memory decline. It's not going to be dramatic like Alzheimer's disease, of course. But I think there's going to be some people who don't notice any big memory decline, but there will be a large proportion of people who will have normal, natural memory decline.
Okay. And finally, just going back to that whole thing about brain cells dying, there was a friend who said to me at one point, Mary, alcohol, that destroys brain cells. Like any amount you drink can destroy your brain cells. Is that true?
So alcohol is an interesting one, right? Because of social notions around alcohol, how close it is to many aspects related to culture. And so it's been part of kind of the human experience for a very, very long time. And I mean, as we know over the past couple of years, the ideas around alcohol and risk, I think, have changed. Our Canadian guidelines are far more strict in terms of what they suggest. I mean, it doesn't say you can't drink, but it mentions that any drinking has some associated risk. And one of the associated risks, I think, with drinking that's very, very well established, it can cause heart disease, it can cause liver disease, it can cause you to be at increased risk of, doing harmful things, getting in accidents and these kinds of things. And so maybe just separate from direct effects, alcohol, if it causes heart disease, can increase your risk of stroke. Increasing your risk of stroke is obviously harmful because that results in brain cells dying. So I think there are indirect things related to alcohol that are harmful for the brain. And I do think that there is enough experimental evidence, and even evidence, if you think about exposing one of the reasons why pregnant women are told not to drink is because it's harmful to the baby's brain. And so we know that alcohol can be harmful to nerve cells. But I think this is, my dad always used to tell me, if you do everything in moderation, things will be okay. And so there's an element of moderation here, and there's an element of a continuum, right? But we do know, it's very well known that for people who have alcohol misuse disorder or who drink a lot, that their brains will actually shrink. And you can see that on an MRI scan. So,
but we're talking about a lot of alcohol, right? Alcohol. Like they're drinking a lot. Okay, they're drinking a lot of alcohol.
But if you didn't want to lose a single brain cell due to alcohol, right?
I don't want to lose a single brain cell, Lorraine.
then probably drinking no alcohol is the way to
go. Wow, that's severe. Maybe not severe for some people, but for people who, as you said earlier, they enjoy a drink once in a while. They like to socialize with their friends. It's part of, it's sort of part of that whole recreational social enjoyment without getting out of hand. And you know what? Someone did also say to me, they said, sure, I get that there's risk. We don't know exactly what that risk might be if, let's say, I have a couple of drinks a week, right? And so that's why the guidelines say, it's just, we can't say exactly what it is, but, it's possibly there for people. And then he said, I have to balance that though with my enjoyment of life.
Yeah.
Right. And so he said, I'm going to have a couple of drinks a week.
For sure. Yeah. And it goes back to could you live with, would you notice if you lost 10 extra nerve cells or 10 extra neurons? Probably not. 100, probably not. It also becomes that kind of aspect too. So you said you didn't want to lose a single brain cell. I think you'll be absolutely fine if you lose a single brain cell. So that is where the balance comes too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, people, but I'm sure people can get super hung up about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. As they did with even the alcohol guidelines. Right. I think it just freaked a lot of people up. Okay. This is great. So, we've covered a bunch of beliefs and myths. Just going back to about, how our conception of the brain has changed. There's been sort of this evolution. And then you were talking about this interaction now we know that the brain has with other parts of the body. Can you be a little more specific about that? Because we did do a whole podcast about the brain and the gut. And I'd love to know what you think about that, how that relationship. And because everybody seems to be interested in that these days.
Yeah, for sure. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna talk about it through the lens of Parkinson's disease, sure. Which is the disease that I focus on both with patients and in the laboratory. And I bring it up also because I think it's a perfect example of evolving knowledge around this connection between the brain and the gut for a lot of reasons. So in Parkinson's disease, even before people have been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is usually because they're having problems with movement or a tremor, if you ask a lot of people, they probably had constipation many, many years in advance. Of course, constipation is common, nonspecific, but that experience of constipation for people who actually develop Parkinson's disease probably is a representation of the disease actually starting in their gut. So the actual nerve cells that help your colon to move so that you can actually, have a bowel movement, those get affected. And that's probably partly, but probably where some of the disease starts in Parkinson's disease decades before. And then,
wait a minute. Has this been established?
so
this is one of the symptoms of Parkinson's early on?
Yes, it's established. Understanding, though, that of course it's a very non-specific symptom, right? Lots of people can have constipation. It doesn't mean you're going to develop Parkinson's disease. But there's definitely a link between people who have Parkinson's disease having had constipation earlier in their life, for sure.
Okay. So what's the connection?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So they're like I said, they're nerve cells that are important to allow us to have, regular bowel movements. Those nerve cells are probably affected early. And then even more interestingly, and this goes again to the gut-brain connection, is that there's probably bacteria, inflammation, something that's happening in the gut that makes those nerve cells susceptible. And this is a totally an area of investigation still, but could you imagine if we knew that these certain bacteria caused harmful inflammation and that caused harm to your nerve cells in your gut? And sorry, I forgot to mention that the idea is that those nerve cells in the gut obviously have to go back into the brain, and that there is a signal that goes from the gut to the brain that then starts the disease process in the brain.
Hold on, let me just stop you there. Why do those nerve cells in the gut have to go back into the brain?
Because they exist that way. Because our brain is giving signals to the gut through these nerve cells. So that actual road exists. And so what's happening possibly is that and we think it's probably an abnormal protein, actually, not an abnormal protein you eat, but an abnormal protein that exists in all of our nerve cells that basically becomes rogue and moves its way back into the brain and then causes other proteins in the brain to also go rogue and harm brain cells. And so this is a very active area of investigation.
This is fascinating. I did not know that. Okay. Yeah. Here's a chicken and egg question for you. So, okay. You said constipation could be an early sign. And constipation, yes, is so common for different reasons. Does the constipation result because Parkinson's is now, for whatever reason, been activated? Or if people eat a certain kind of diet, they become constipated, and that can actually increase the risk of Parkinson's if you have maybe other things at play that make it an environment that's conducive for you to get Parkinson's? Like which is which?
And the jury is out. Yes. And so I think that we don't know. Of course, the latter would be really interesting because then you could actually, you could imagine some interventions, right? I mean, you make sure that bowel.
Yeah, but also not good.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
Not good at all.
But yeah, these are all unanswered questions, and a very active area of investigation. Because even, we can talk about the microbiome, so the bacteria that live in the gut, they could be different in people with Parkinson's. Is that because they're constipated and then so bacteria that live there become different? Right. Or is it that the bacteria are different and then that's why people become constipated? And then there's this whole, this whole idea that the types of bacteria then cause certain kinds of inflammation. And then the inflammation is bad for brain cells and these proteins, and then that leads to Parkinson's disease. And maybe in the other podcast you had, and getting back to that description of finding new brain cells in the brain is, there's been discoveries that certain cells that live peripherally, certain immune cells that come from different parts of the brain actually find their way into the brain. And, some of these may be related to inflammation in the gut.
Right. Yes, that's right. So, and still on the topic of inflammation, because of course people are very interested in that as well. When you look at some of the biggest advancements that have been made in brain research and disease, so diseases related to I guess pretty much every disease is related to the brain, really, when you think about it. But, where have we made the biggest advancements? Like what diseases, generally speaking, would you say, it's been amazing, let's say the last, 10, 20 years, 30 years?
Yeah, for me, hands down, I'd say multiple sclerosis. And in particular, we talk about actual therapies that, we have lots of different treatments that could maybe sometimes help symptoms. So if I give an example of epilepsy and a seizure. So a seizure is a symptom, right? It's a manifestation of a process that's going on in the brain for a variety of different reasons. And there's lots of medications that can stop seizures. I'm sure my epilepsy colleagues will explain that there's a lot of limitations to many of them, but there's lots of different medications to stop seizures. But those don't stop the actual cause of or slow down the diseases that are causing the seizures. Whereas in multiple sclerosis, they have treatments which we call disease modifying therapies. So the disease modifying part means that if you're on a trajectory to have, a course of a disease that worsens over time like this, or kind of worsens over time like this, that it can actually flatten that out or reduce the ups and the downs. And multiple sclerosis over the past, since when I trained, started training as a neurologist between now, they have a huge list of different disease modifying therapies. And if I contrast that to Parkinson's disease, we have no disease modifying therapies for Parkinson's disease. So I think one of the biggest advances for neurology has been in multiple sclerosis. And you probably asked because, it is in part a disease related to inflammation in the immune system.
Right. Whereas Parkinson's is what?
Well, sorry. So Parkinson's, and that this could be a whole discussion as well. In the past, it had been thought that the immune system and inflammation doesn't really play a big part in Parkinson's disease, that there's inflammation that happens, but that's more reactionary. The brain cells die, and then one of the reactions that happens is that immune cells or inflammatory cells kind of go in to try and clean up the mess. But what we know now is that's probably not the case, and there is probably an inflammatory start to the disease, even for things like Alzheimer's disease. That could be a start to the disease, and it's the inflammation and the abnormal immune cells that lead to brain cell death. And the same is true but it has been far longer accepted in multiple sclerosis that it is abnormal immune cells and inflammation that are really attacking the nervous system. And so many of the therapies that have really made huge differences in multiple sclerosis act at the level of the immune system. And as a consequence, have really made big differences to the lives of people who've been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
So then if there is a connection with inflammation, right, with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, then why hasn't there been advancement, like further advancement with Parkinson's and similar diseases, right? Like, can we actually separate certain groups of diseases and like MS, and maybe there are other ones similar to it that have benefited from the research, right? That MS has undergone, whereas maybe Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, there might be a group of other diseases that they just haven't advanced as far. And I'd like to know why. Like, what's the reason?
Yeah, I think.
And don't say funding. I know funding's a whole other issue.
I won't say funding. Although, more funding for brain diseases in general would allow us to do far more. But I think there are other things separate from funding for sure. And I think there are multiple reasons. So, one goes back to the aspects around the immune system, just how clear it had been known early on in multiple sclerosis that immune abnormalities were key players. And it's relatively, easy to test cells related to the immune system because many of them you can actually just get from your blood and study them. So that I think has been helpful to understand how immune cells work. It's been helpful for multiple sclerosis. Okay. It's been helpful for, rheumatoid arthritis and a variety of other conditions that are involved.
So were they further along kind of the knowledge trail? And they were able to work on that and then come up with these drugs and therapies.
Yes, for sure. For sure. And even some of the, treatments that are used in multiple sclerosis were first used in different immune conditions, or inflammatory conditions. And so they were able to take advantage of that. Of course, there are some very specific MS drugs that have been developed, understanding aspects related specifically to the immune system and multiple sclerosis, but they were definitely further along. I mean, our understanding of the immune system has always been further along than our understanding of the nervous system. That's always been the way it has been, for probably, again, a variety of reasons.
I saw at this presentation, this Parkinson's patient, and they did some kind of, and I don't know what the medical term is, but they did something in this person's brain, some stimulation or something. And it was incredible because they showed a before and after of this, this woman could barely, like she couldn't walk in a straight line. She was just kind of stumbling around. Then after this treatment, she was able to walk. Yes. Like, I mean, if I didn't know her, I'd think, oh, she's okay. She doesn't really have a problem.
Yeah. So that is deep brain stimulation, or DBS for short. And that
is that the Michael J. Fox thing?
No, it's not actually.
Okay.
Michael J. Fox has never had deep brain stimulation interestingly has opted not to. But it is a treatment that not all people with Parkinson's disease will be eligible for, because not every Parkinson's patient will benefit from it. But that goes back to the circuits aspect. And so what deep brain stimulation does, although, again, we don't fully understand how it works, is it stimulates circuits in the brain that we know, in the case that you saw, involved primarily with movement, right? And basically boosts it. Although, again, we don't clearly understand exactly how it does that. But it can result in remarkable, I mean, these exactly like the description that you have of somebody being completely immobile, and then you turn on the actual stimulation and they're able to do something, or somebody who has like a horrible tremor and then you turn on the stimulation and it goes away. But that's affecting a circuit. It doesn't stop brain cells from dying, which is why, if what sometimes people wonder, well, why wouldn't we just do deep brain stimulation with everybody? Is that it can really help the circuit. But as the brain cells die and the circuit still becomes more compromised, then these kinds of benefits or other aspects related to Parkinson's disease kind of overshadow the benefits that you can get with deep brain stimulation.
And I wonder, I mean, you can't speak for all clinicians who see Parkinson's patients, but, or for that matter, any person coming in with a disease. But yeah, I mean, for sure, everybody wants to be cured. Nobody wants to have that disease. But then when you're dealing with patients one-on-one, right? I mean, how do you be realistic, but also still give hope?
Right. So, of course, one way to give people hope is to ensure that they know that research is happening, that people are trying to understand the disease and find new treatments. But another way that's important, I think, to allow people to have hope is to know that they can still live full lives, and to talk about that with them and encourage them to do that. So maximizing their quality of life, finding ways to do that, whether that be, taking medications to help them to move better, being involved in exercise classes or dance classes to be able to allow them to be physically active and make social connections. In some cases, it's talking about stopping work sooner than maybe they had expected, retiring earlier, so that they can find time to take care of themselves. And I often tell people that having Parkinson's disease is a license for self-care. So all of us should be sleeping well and eating well and exercising and spending time with loved ones. But I think when a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease is given, that has to be a major focus, because that's going to really maximize quality of life. And that's where I think hope remains for people with Parkinson's.
I'm not sure where you're at with your research, but what's the question that keeps you up at night? Like you think, oh, if I could only find the answer to this particular problem, it would just open up so many things. Like it would, you know what I mean? It would be an avenue to so many possibilities. Like what's the next question for you?
Yeah, I wish there was a single question. It's a multitude of questions. Like, do we have this right? Are we on the right path of knowing the way that we think that this disease happens? Are we missing something? What do we have blind spots? Often in areas where, you have a very active hypothesis that much of the field is focusing on, do we have blind spots around that? And should we be making sure that we try and think about new areas or kind of go against the norm? I think those are aspects. And the other thing that kind of keeps me up at night too is, did we actually have some right answers in the past? And those got buried for some reason because the popular idea was not in favor of that, or there was some study that maybe was poorly designed and was negative, and so everybody said, oh, that must not be correct. And so I worry that maybe there's some things that we already should have, that we knew previously, and we kind of quashed those ideas for a variety of different reasons. Those are the kinds of things I think that keep me up at night.
Yeah, that'll keep you up the whole night. But when it comes to your own research, what do you hope you're going to find sort of the next answer to with your own research?
Yeah, my own research, I really hope that we can actually take something from the laboratory and, during my career, get it as far as testing it in people. People call it this valley of death. People sit in the lab and learn a lot about the disease and find a whole bunch of cures that can cure rats with Parkinson's disease, or, make cells in a dish live longer. But does that really ever make its way into a clinical trial? And that's where I really hope some of our research will get to, that we'll actually be the ones who will try and cross that valley of death to get it into clinical trials. And maybe we'll fail in clinical trials, but I really wish that it won't just kind of not fail in the lab, but just never see the light of day, just only ever kind of be a paper in a scientific publication that says, maybe we have something that's good for Parkinson's disease, but we never took it the extra mile to actually prove to ourselves whether or not it could make a difference.
I really enjoyed this discussion, Lorraine. Yeah, all the best with your research, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. It was great talking with you.
That's Lorraine Kalia. She is a neurologist and senior scientist with the Krembil Brain Institute at the University Health Network in Toronto. For more information on Lorraine and her research, you can check out our show notes. That is it for The Brain today on CRAM. Hope you enjoyed it. You can follow us on social to get the latest on our podcasts. Our handle is @CRAM Ideas. And we certainly depend on your support. So if you'd like to make a donation, you can head over to our website, cramideas.com. We would very much appreciate it. Thanks for joining us today. See you back here next time.